Before we begin, I need you to do something for me. Think about the friendliest person on your street, the guy who waves at you every morning, the man who remembers your kid's name, the neighbor who shows up to every block party with a six-pack and a smile, the one everybody trusts without thinking twice about why. Now imagine he has a basement, and imagine what's in it. That single thought, that nauseating, stomach-dropping shift from safe to unthinkable is the entire engine of the Black Phone. And it's the reason this movie doesn't just frighten you while you're watching it. It follows you afterward, days later, when you're walking to your car at night. You suddenly remember that the most dangerous predators in recorded history were almost never lurking in shadows. They were standing in the light, smiling, waving, offering to help. The Black Phone was released in 2022, directed by Scott Derrickson, the filmmaker behind Sinister and Doctor Strange, and it immediately established itself as one of the most psychologically effective horror films in years. It follows 12-year-old Finney Shaw, played with quiet, devastating intensity by Mason Thames, who is abducted by a masked killer known only as the Grabber, portrayed by Ethan Hawke with a performance so controlled and precise it becomes genuinely difficult to watch. Trapped in a soundproofed basement with a disconnected black telephone bolted to the wall, Finney begins receiving calls from the killer's previous victims, dead children, reaching back through static and silence to give him one final chance to survive. The film is based on a short story by Joe Hill, yes, that Joe Hill, Stephen King's son, who has spent his career doing exactly what his father taught him, taking real-world fear and running it through the engine of the supernatural until the two become inseparable. But here is the thing most casual viewers never fully investigate. The Grabber is not a purely fictional creation. He is not assembled from nothing. He is built deliberately, carefully, with full creative intent from the documented reality of a specific era, and most undeniably from the biography of one of the most notorious killers in American history. His name was John Wayne Gacy, and by the time this video is over, you will understand exactly why the creators made that choice, and why they were right to. Let's talk about what evil actually looks like. Because we've been trained by decades of horror cinema to believe that evil announces itself, that it lives in abandoned houses at the end of dead-end roads, that it has hollow eyes and a disturbing gait and some quality, some undeniable, visible wrongness that sets it apart from ordinary people. John Wayne Gacy was the permanent, documented refutation of that belief. On the surface, and I need you to sit with how genuinely absurd this is, Gacy was a model citizen. He lived in a modest, well-maintained home in the Norwood Park Township suburb of Chicago. He ran a successful construction company. He was a Democratic precinct captain, active in local politics. He organized charity fundraisers. He threw elaborate neighborhood parties with tents and catering and hundreds of smiling, comfortable guests who had no reason to be anything other than comfortable. And at those parties, and at children's hospitals, and at community events, John Wayne Gacy performed as a clown. He went by the name of Pogo the Clown, a character he had personally designed, complete with hand-sewn costume, face paint, and a rehearsed routine of balloon animals and physical comedy. Parents willingly handed their children to him for photographs. He was given access to some of the most trusting, most vulnerable people imaginable, children and the sick, because his painted face communicated the most powerful lie a human being can tell with their appearance. I am safe. I am here to make you smile. Between 1972 and 1978, John Wayne Gacy murdered at least 33 teenage boys and young men. 6 years in that same quiet suburb, in that same cheerful, well-kept house. His method had a cold, predatory logic to it. He would approach young men, teenagers looking for work, runaways, boys he had met through his contracting business, and offer them something simple: money, a job, a ride home, the currency of basic human trust. Once inside his home, the performance ended. What followed belongs in a category of horror that clinical language can describe but cannot fully convey. He buried 26 of his victims beneath the crawl space under his house. 26 human beings beneath the floor of a house where he cooked meals, watched television, and hosted parties for people who liked him. When investigators finally searched the property in December 1978, following the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast, who had last been seen accepting an offer of work from Gacy, the scene they encountered was incomprehensible. They dug for days. Each morning they returned expecting to be finished. Each morning there was more. The remaining victims, those Gacy had run out of space for, had been thrown from a bridge into the Des Plaines River. Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978, convicted of 33 counts of murder, executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. At no point during the legal proceedings did he demonstrate meaningful remorse. Now hold all of that in your mind: the clown, the crawl space, the suburban parties, the young boys, the hidden basement, the cheerful face over the unspeakable secret. And let's go back to the block phone. Because what Joe Hill did when he wrote the original short story, and what Scott Derrickson and C. Robert Cargill did when they adapted it for the screen, was not accidental. It was not coincidence, and it is far more deliberate and far more intelligent than the film has ever fully received credit for.
Before we go further, one important clarification, because intellectual honesty matters, especially in true crime. The Grabber is not a one-to-one portrait of John Wayne Gacy. He's a composite figure, assembled from multiple sources. The general atmosphere of fear that defined 1970s suburban America, the archetype of the predator hiding in plain sight, and the specific, undeniable DNA of John Wayne Gacy. Joe Hill has been open about this. In interviews discussing the original short story, he acknowledged that Pogo the Clown was a direct and primary influence on the character, the killer who performed for children, who weaponized trust and entertainment, who hid something monstrous beneath a mask of community warmth. When Scott Derrickson and Cargill adopted the story for the screen, they made one notable change. They transformed the Grabber from a clown into a magician. The reason, reportedly, was practical. A child kidnapping clown in 2022 would inevitably draw comparisons to Pennywise from It, and the filmmakers wanted the Grabber to stand apart. The costume changed. The DNA did not. With that established, here are the connections, and they are not subtle. The first parallel, the performance. The Grabber uses his act as a magician to get close to Finney. He approaches with tricks, with wonder, with the theatrical language of entertainment. He becomes someone a child would be curious about rather than afraid of. He lowers the guard not with force, but with fascination. Come see, come closer, just for a moment. This is exactly what Pogo the Clown did. The medium is different, magic instead of face paint, card tricks instead of balloon animals, but the mechanism is identical. Both men weaponized childhood wonder. Both men understood that the most effective way to access a child is not through intimidation, but through delight. The specific cruelty of that tactic, its calculated exploitation of the precise quality that makes children children, their open, trusting curiosity about the world, is one of the most disturbing psychological threads connecting these two figures across fiction and reality. The second parallel, the basement. In the film, the grabber keeps his victims in a soundproofed basement beneath a completely ordinary suburban house, sealed, hidden, invisible to the world outside, which continues without any awareness of what is happening below its feet. The crawlspace beneath Gacy's home is this, almost exactly. Not a remote location, not a secret facility, the floor of a house where parties happened, where neighbors visited, where the mail was delivered and the lawn was mown on schedule. The geographic banality of the hiding place is precisely what makes it so deeply disturbing in both versions. Evil did not retreat to somewhere remote and recognizable as dangerous. Evil stayed in the neighborhood. Evil hosted dinner parties directly above its own evidence. The third parallel, the timeline and what it carries. The Black Phone is set in North Denver in 1978. This is not an aesthetic choice or a nostalgic flourish, it is a surgical decision. 1978 is the year John Wayne Gacy was arrested. The film takes place during the exact period when his crimes had reached their peak, when the national conversation about missing children had become a permanent, low-frequency panic broadcast across every local news station in America. Parents were terrified in a specific, newly articulate way. Children were being handed a new set of survival instructions. Don't talk to strangers. Don't get in anyone's car. Don't trust a friendly face you don't recognize from home. Stranger danger was not a slogan. It was grief codified. It was the language of parents who had already lost children, translated into rules for the ones who remained. And Scott Derrickson knew that atmosphere from the inside. He grew up in North Denver in the late 1970s. In interviews, he's described the film as a direct excavation of his own childhood, not just visually, but emotionally. The constant background hum of anxiety, the way ordinary suburban streets felt safe and threatening simultaneously, the specific generational fear of a child who understood without being told in so many words that something was happening in the world that adults were struggling to contain. 1978 was also, not coincidentally, the year Ted Bundy was arrested in Florida following a string of murders across multiple states. It was 3 years after the disappearance cases that would eventually inspire the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, established after the murder of Adam Walsh in 1981. The year was not just Gacy's year, it was the year an entire nation confronted the possibility that the monsters were already living among them. The atmosphere of the Black Phone, that dread that hums beneath every scene, that sense of a neighborhood that cannot name what it is afraid of, is the authentic emotional texture of that specific, historically documented moment. The fourth parallel, the psychology of the game. The grabber does not simply imprison Finney, he creates a structure. He calls his psychological manipulation Naughty Boy, a name with the sickening incongruity of childlike language draped over something unspeakable. He establishes rules. He maintains the architecture of control with a precision that goes beyond practical necessity. The game is not incidental to the horror. The game is the horror. Power, dominance, and a sadistic pleasure in watching the victim navigate the maze he has constructed, these are the satisfactions that drive him. This maps precisely onto the documented psychology of predatory serial offenders. Control was never simply a means to an end for Gacy. The manipulation of his victims, the sense of complete psychological sovereignty over another person, was itself part of what he sought. The game was the point. The fifth parallel, the mask with two faces. The grabber's mask is one of the most intelligently designed pieces of costuming in recent horror. It has two interchangeable faces, one grinning, one grimacing. At a surface level, it is striking and unsettling. At the level of meaning, it is a direct visual dissection of the Gacy psychology. Two faces.
The smiling public face, the contractor, the community organizer, the clown who entertained children at charity events, and the other face, the one that only emerged when the doors were closed and the performance was over. The mask is not a stylistic flourish, it is a psychological diagram of what made John Wayne Gacy not just possible, but invisible for 6 years. The coexistence of two completely irreconcilable identities within a single human being, maintained without apparent strain across thousands of ordinary daily interactions, that is the most genuinely terrifying concept in this entire story. And the block phone places it literally on the villain's face so you cannot avoid looking at it.
The black phone achieves something that almost no horror film in recent memory has managed. It looks directly at everything we have just discussed: the documented reality of men like Gacy, the authentic terror of the 1970s, the specific and historically grounded helplessness of a child in a predator's basement, and it refuses to let that be the whole truth. Because in reality, it was the whole truth. For 33 documented young men, there was no last-minute escape. There was no supernatural intervention. There was no phone on the wall carrying voices from the other side. There was the crawl space and the river, and the years that their families spent not knowing what had happened to them or where they were. The black phone does not pretend otherwise. It earns its supernatural turn precisely because it never minimizes the real-world horror that grounds it. Finney's basement is genuinely dangerous. The grabber is genuinely frightening. The film never winks at you, never reassures you that everything will be fine, never treats the threat as anything less than what it is. And then it makes one extraordinary creative choice. The phone rings. A disconnected phone with no power source, no line, no signal, and it rings. And when Finney answers it, the dead answer back. The grabber's previous victims, one by one, each carrying a piece of the knowledge that Finney needs to survive. Robin, who fought and lost, but who knew something about the dirt floor. The boy who found a tunnel. The one who located a loose brick behind the mattress. Each of them failed alone, in isolation, without the benefit of what came before. Together, speaking through static and impossibility, they construct the blueprint for the escape none of them achieved. That image is one of the most quietly beautiful things in contemporary horror cinema. It takes the specific, documented reality that Gacy's victims had no such allies, no one reaching through from the other side, no collective wisdom of the lost, and it inverts it, not to deny the horror of what actually happened, but to imagine a different moral architecture, one in which suffering is not simply consumed by the void, one in which what the dead endured can still serve a purpose for the living. And Gwen, Finney's sister, her psychic visions arriving in dreams she doesn't ask for and can barely interpret, she represents something equally essential. She is every family member who refused to accept a missing child as simply missing, every mother who kept calling the police, every investigator who didn't close the file, every person on the outside of a locked door who kept pushing on it because someone they loved was behind it. In reality, those people didn't always succeed in time. In this story, improbably, they do. This is what separates the block phone from most horror films that trade on true crime aesthetics. It is not interested in the aesthetics of atrocity for their own sake. It is interested in what we do with the knowledge of atrocity, how we transmit it, how we survive it, how we honor the ones who didn't. Every generation has its version of the grabber. Every generation discovers with fresh and particular shock that the most dangerous people are often the most visible ones. The era changes, the costume changes. Clown to magician,
contractor to community leader, the mechanism remains the same. And every generation of children has had to develop its own version of the knowledge that the dead boys passed to Finney through the telephone. This is what was done to us. This is what we learned. This is how you fight. Stranger danger was not a slogan, it was a transmission. It was the living speaking in the voice of the dead, trying to pass something essential forward through time. That is the black telephone. That is what it has always been. Joe Hill, Scott Derrickson, and Cargill took the worst of what was real and ran it through the alchemy of supernatural fiction to produce something that is simultaneously a nightmare and a testament. They built the grabber from documented horror, set him in a historically authentic landscape of fear, and then gave his intended victim something his real-world counterparts never had: the accumulated knowledge of everyone who came before him, delivered through an impossible phone on a basement wall. The block phone does not promise that evil will always lose. It does not offer false comfort or a guarantee of rescue. It only promises this: that even in the darkest basement, you are never entirely alone. That the ones who came before you, who faced what you are facing, who failed where you still have a chance to succeed, they are still here, still on the line, still willing to tell you what they know. That may be the most terrifying thing in this film, and it may also be the most hopeful. And sometimes, in horror, in history, in the real and documented darkness of the world we actually live in, those two things are the same thing. Lock the door tonight. Think about the phone. And if it rings, answer it.
For those who want to go deeper, and in the true crime and horror essay space, this is rare, which is exactly why it matters. On Joe Hill and the original short story. Joe Hill, 20th Century Ghosts, 2005, the short story collection containing The Black Phone. Hill's interviews with IO9, Esquire, and Rolling Stone discuss the Gacy influence directly. On Scott Derrickson and the film's atmosphere. Derrickson's interviews with The Ringer, Collider, and Empire Magazine 2022 discuss growing up in North Denver and the emotional authenticity of the setting. On John Wayne Gacy. Killer Clown by Terry Sullivan and Peter Mikan, 1983, the definitive early account, written by the prosecuting attorney. Harold Schechter's Serial Killer Files provides essential, broader context. On the 1970s Stranger Danger era. Paula S. Foss, Kidnapped, Child Abduction in America, 1997, a serious historical account of how child abduction fear shaped American culture across the 20th century.